Would you tell me your name, please?
My name is Nina Kaleska.
And where and when were you born?
I was born in Grodno, which was then Poland, on April 11th, 1929.
Can you tell me something about your family?
Yes, we were a small family. I just had one sister who was 5 years older than I. I was the baby of the family. My father was a forester. My mother was a homemaker. And I came from a family where education was very highly stressed. On any level, languages were highly stressed. And music was very highly stressed. We were all a very musical family. And Grodno was a town, a very lovely small town, considering in the context of American cities, it was a small town. But a town that had a lot of educational establishments, and the opera would, for instance, come and perform. I never traveled very much as a child, except for into the immediate outskirts. And I came from a family where there was a great deal of love and a great deal of concern and a great deal of care. And that continued until our total separation, which came actually in 1941 for me.
Tell me a little bit more about your friends growing up. What was school like? What kind of schools did you go to, for instance?
I have attended a number of different schools, probably because my mother and father were looking at what was the best educational outlet rather than a particular school. I went to a Hebrew school, which I didn't like terribly much. And then my sister and I spent about a year or two in a Catholic school. There were only 5 or 6 children, and we had, strangely enough for Poland at that time, Hebrew instructions. But there was an excellent private school. And then after that, I attended a gymnasium, and my formal education per se actually was abruptly stopped in my 5th grade level.
What about friends?
Well, my sister was a great athlete. She was a champion skater, champion swimmer. She was very musical, played a number of instruments. I was given piano lessons, ballet lessons. I was particularly interested in the theater. And during the Russian occupation from 1939 to 1941, the Russian authorities go after talent and recognize it, or want to recognize it, at a rather early stage. So they said to my parents, look, we're not interested in how well she will do academically. We have discovered that she has a very lovely voice, and she's very musical, and she dances well, and she does very well on stage. We are going to overlook her theatrical career. And so I sang as a soloist at the age of 10 with all of the major choirs. I designed and choreographed some ballet without knowing anything about it. It was just a natural outlet, you know. I played with a lot of my friends. We would invent some wonderful plays. It wasn't a store-bought toy. We would play house, we would play, I remember reading a great deal, in addition to Pushkin, and in addition to the other authors, a lot of the movie magazines. And so we pretended that I was Greta Garbo and my friend would be Marlena Dietrich, and we would just go on that way and get some carrots and potatoes from our kitchens and pretend that we were homemakers and children and all that. So we really had a very kind of a free, delightful existence, in spite of the fact that the anti-Semitic climate was very strong, and we were all rather blue-eyed, blonde, fair hair, so that no people who didn't know that I belonged to a synagogue, that my parents did, that I was Jewish. But there were pogroms, quite a few of them, And I kept asking, what's going on? It's very hard for parents to explain because we believe in a different religion or we belong to a synagogue rather than a church, that people don't like you. And so I grew up both on one level happily because I was loved and protected and got the best possible education that I could through my parents. And family life was very important. And I imagine that that kind of upbringing and that kind of rooted, embedded understanding of my parents that they gave to both my sister and myself probably helped me a great deal later on to have that base, that strength of knowing who you are, without understanding it, without going into any philosophical discussions about that. And so that I grew up we did not live in a ghetto. We lived in a perfectly beautiful apartment near the river Niemen. My mother was more religious than my father. And we were religious, I suppose, like everyone else, without being fanatic about it. And my childhood was really quite free of any worries, except for the fact that I started to recognize that there were stones being thrown at our windows towards 1938, 1939. And I was also told that on Passover, which was very beautiful in our home, and my father would, I'm sure to the dismay of my mother, invited half of the people who had nowhere to go to our home so they could share that special evening with us, that the Christian children were told that the Jews drink the blood of Christian children during the Passover Seder. And it's something that a child, even as an adult, I cannot quite comprehend. But that's the kind of archaic teaching that eventually, with ignorance, led to the disaster of the catastrophe of the Holocaust. So when you ask me what was my childhood, I can describe it in terms by saying that it was a pleasant, delightful, carefree, surrounded by a lot of love and a lot of attention, and the handwriting, even as a child, without understanding, were already lingering in the background.
How did this change when the Russians came? What else happened to you, to your life, in addition to the special schoolings? Were there any other changes from 39 to 41 that you noticed?
Yes, as a matter of fact, not understanding what Stalin stood for, not understanding politics per se, I loved being there at that time because the pogroms have stopped. I was indicted into what they call the Young Pioneers group. They showered a great deal of attention on the children because that's the way they get them. My parents probably were dismayed and couldn't do anything about that. My father, I believe, was in prison for about 3 or 4 months because he must have said, I didn't really know why, but it was obviously for political reasons. He may have said something that did not please the communist people. Now, you have to understand, Grodno is about, I'm not sure that I'm being accurate, but it's about 60 miles from the Lithuanian border, or maybe less. So that entire area was a changeable area geographically. It was first, my parents were born there, or close by, and then it was Russia. When I was born, it was Poland. And in 1944, it was Russia again, and it is Russia now. So that I did not speak Russian until 1939. I spoke Polish. We did speak Yiddish, but my Yiddish was not terribly good. We spoke basically Polish, and when my mother didn't want me to understand something, my sister, and I would get furious about that, and she would speak Russian or French to each other. And of course, at that time, I still didn't speak either one of those languages. Well, Russia, the Soviet Union occupied that part of, well, Germany, in 1939, as we know, Poland was divided. Half of it went to the Nazis, and the other half, the traditional northeastern part, went to the Russians. And Bialystok and Grodno and that entire area became Russian. I went to school. I loved it. I learned White Russian because that is really Belarus, and Russian, and did a lot of dancing, a lot of gymnastics. My sister was the one who really was a known gymnastist, and I had won quite a few competitions in singing and dancing, and they encouraged that sort of thing. And life seemed perfectly all right. And then in September of 1941, everything broke. And we were hiding in the bunkers because the air raids were pretty severe. And very shortly, the following day, somebody walked out of the compound and said, "We've just seen German tanks." Now again, you have to understand, I did not understand the idea of what German tanks, what kind of ominous clouds that would sweep around Europe, and what it would mean that the German tanks are in front of your door.
What did you do when you heard German tanks, when your family heard German tanks? What did you and your family do?
They were very frightened. They recognized, because we had known, we did hear terrible stories coming out from the other part of Poland, people who escaped, what was happening to the Jewish community. But again, I must say that maybe because I was playing with dolls one day, and the next day I was asked to be a grown-up, it hadn't quite sunk in what the tragedy of the entire period meant. I could only reflect today, as I have post-Holocaust. When I was in it, I didn't really know what was going on. We were in a vacuum. I was in a vacuum. I can only speak for myself.
That's what we want to talk about, of course, is what you did and thought then rather than now. Then, what did you do? Did school continue, for example?
No, not in 41, right. In 1941, school did not continue. It was actually not even the beginning of the school semester. Very shortly after, we were still in our apartment. Within a matter of a few months, if I remember correctly, they had two ghettos in Grodno. The upper ghetto and the ghetto in not very far from where we lived. And very shortly, the entire Jewish population of Grodno was being uprooted from their home. And that I remember very distinctly and with great pain. We had some beautiful china. We had a very lovely home. Wasn't rich, but it was beautiful. The Germans would come in and simply at the whim of a wisp, just like that, remove the most beautiful china and just throw it against the wall to break it for fun. And started to taunt and tease. And you didn't really have to be old or young to recognize that this was the devil in the flesh. We were evacuated to the ghetto uptown. Both my father and my mother and my sister and I. My mother was one of three sisters. One had come to this country, and the other was married to a prominent professor with three children. One of my cousins was a young man who was, I believe, only 23, but he was considered to be a genius. So much so, electronic, that the Germans used him for 2 years as what they called ein nützlicher Jude, a useful Jew. And when they have extracted what they needed, they killed him. His older sister, my other cousin, completed the Warsaw Conservatoire and was a concert pianist, and somehow managed to escape to Alma-Ata in Russia. The younger of the three cousins stayed with her mother. Because my uncle was considered in high intelligentsia, they rounded them up and they killed them. When we were in the second ghetto, I believe my cousin, just my aunt and and her younger daughter were with us. We had improvised schools, meaning that we still believed that the world may not have gone mad altogether, and that we will need an education. And so we continued with our studies on an improvised basis by having the teachers who were there get the children and get them together. I'll tell you something rather interesting. My father worked as a forester. That means that he was a specialist in wood and primarily worked with peasants. Poland is known for beautiful woods. He was extremely well liked. I remember my father more often on a horse, in a leather cap, in a leather jacket, and leather boots, riding on either, we had two horses, a white one and a gray one. My father came home one day and said that some peasant family said, "Let me have your children for you. They are both very light, they don't look Jewish. Why don't you let us have them? We will hide them for you." And I remember having a little conference, and both my sister and I said, "No, if we cannot be together, then we're not going to be without you." In November of 1942, the second ghetto where I was with my family got split up. They were obviously starting the evacuation process to the many camps that we didn't know anything about.
Can you hold it for 1 minute?
Sure.
I'd like you to describe the life in the first ghetto. What was your daily life like? You mentioned school. What else was going on?
With all due respect, I cannot be absolutely clear and remember to that extent, except that it was bearable. It was bearable to the fact that my parents were with me, my sister was with me. We tried to improvise and play. I had no idea. I'm sure my parents felt differently because I was so young. And because I was so young, I didn't stop to think what is going on, except that somehow we were not at home. We shared a room with many other people. Life was not normal, but we were still a family. And then, very abruptly, as they usually do those things, and for me, I don't know what went on with the other ghetto, with the first ghetto. As I said, we were in the second ghetto. They probably started to, in fact, I'm sure they started to evacuate, because this was already in 1942. No doubt that the Jews who were in the German part of Poland had already been evacuated. But this is the eastern part, and they had to start a whole new program. Excuse me. They rounded us up. We had no idea why. I had no idea why. Maybe the others did. My parents and I, my sister and I, and my parents were separated. My sister and I were taken by trucks to ghetto number 1. We had no idea what happened to our parents. I had subsequently learned that that transport went to Auschwitz, and they never even entered the camp, as most of them, of course, did not. My sister and I remained in the first ghetto. That was already very, very difficult. It was winter time. The selections were, in other words, the evacuation process began quite earnestly. We worked in a tobacco factory. My sister and I would share a tiny little cot in somebody's house. In fact, the house belonged to a friend of mine who they were no longer there. And we managed to hide every time, like maybe 3 or 4 not selections, because they were not called selections, but the raids. That was to find the Jews to send them to wherever they were sending them. We didn't know where. We managed to escape, and we continued to give ourselves some kind of moral support by saying, "Look, we'll probably leave here, and I'm sure we'll be with our parents again." But on January probably the 18th or 20th, somewhere around there, 1943, we hid behind very heavy snow behind the synagogue, which is where they would run around everybody up. And we could no longer hide. We were found and walked to the station. And what was so dreadful? And I remember that. I did not see Shoah, but they told me about that. The people were standing and watching as their neighbors, I don't know, I didn't recognize anyone, but were being obviously dragged without too much clothes, without any necessarily private possessions, to the train station. And then we saw the cattle cars. And that's when the reality set in, but I still had no idea that a place like Auschwitz existed. That they were still actually burning people. We didn't know that. My sister gave me my mother's coat, a long coat. And I think that coat may have been responsible for my going into the camp rather than to the crematoria right away. My sister was very bright. She was very clever. She was absolutely wonderful, tremendously liked. Her name was Sala. And the train ride was probably one of the worst things that I can possibly remember. The train ride was utterly horrendous. People died. There was no water. There were no sanitary facilities. There was no food. Whatever was had gone very quickly. It was about 3.5 days. And then we stopped and we saw Auschwitz. And we said, I bet you we're going to meet our parents. Well, we were right to some extent, except that we didn't meet them. During the time that we came down, in other words, we were disembarked or lit from the train, Sala said to me, don't speak, don't move, let me think for a moment. We were about 2,500 people. And I have a book, by the way, from somebody from Grodno, who had just published the entire history of the Jews of Grodno. And it's the most incredible thing is that even my number is mentioned there. So that I learned something about, as I said, these are documentations that are there because there was a trial of the Nazis of Grodno. Maybe I was very dumb or just very young, but I didn't understand or knew as much as many other people did. When we embarked, my sister noticed that the majority of the people from the train were being pushed to one side, and a rather small group was being pushed to one side, both men and women. She said, don't ask any questions, just walk over to that small group. And she followed me. And the guard said, Genug. There were 85 women and 120 men out of something like 2,500 who were then brought into Auschwitz. The rest went directly to the crematoria. Now, we didn't know about that. But after one day, you did know. Because at that time, when I came to Auschwitz, which was January 24th, 1943, the chimneys were very high and the smell of flesh was very prominent. And you no longer could pretend that this is a place where we're going to meet our parents. So this was my introduction to Auschwitz. And I suppose you would want to know what happened, and I will tell you briefly.
Let's slow down a little.
All right.
Tell me when you arrived into the camp. Where were you taken and what did you do?
We were taken to a block, I don't know exactly where. We then were asked to undress completely, naked. I had some photographs of my family which were torn to shreds. Hair was completely shaved, and a rather painful tattoo was put on my left forearm. My sister knew my terrible fear of doctors as a child, I don't know why, and she kept whispering to me, be brave. And my number was 31386. Her number was 31387. And in those days, they gave the numbers smack in the front of the left forearm, not inside. I think they ran out of space or ran out of numbers, or maybe they recognized that perhaps it's not such a good idea to be quite so prominent about that. For your information, I had it plastically removed in London. Not because I don't want to remember, but because I don't always wish to talk about it. Or to talk about it perhaps in an interview such as this, where it has meaning and it has a realistic archival value for the future. Alright, so we were stripped and the hair was shaven and the number was tattooed, and we were given clothing of dead Russian prisoners of war and taken to some block. And that was the beginning of 2 years.
Tell me about who was that? I
have no idea. They were speaking all different languages. I did not know German, I did not know Hungarian. Actually, the Hungarians came later. Mainly, I think the people in that time were from Poland, Polish Jews. Possibly Czechoslovakian, but I really am not totally sure, so I can't tell you, because later on, you know, day and night became, time had no meaning at that point. But it was dreadfully hard, because the winters are very difficult. The mud, when it rained, it was just muddy. Food was unbearable. If you eventually learned to eat that, but it was uneatable, really.
What did you have to eat?
I think, the fact is, and my sister and I used to joke, because my mother and my father would make me eat like so many parents, drink your milk, here's a piece of chocolate, I'll take you here, the bribery aspect, because I was very thin. In fact, I was the youngest of everyone, and the sickliest of everyone. Apparently they thought I had some kind of a heart condition, which may not have been true, but my parents were very protective of my health. So I wasn't allowed to climb trees, which I wanted to do, and all that sort of thing. And this is the irony, that I'm the one who survived, and my sister, who was never sick in her life, died 3 months later. And I was glad that she died. And I will tell you in a minute why I say that in such candor. We were going to work. These were probably the most horrendously difficult months, the first 3 months. If you survived the first day, maybe you survived the second. If you made it to the week, chances are you might make it to the second week. Time had no meaning. We were very shortly put to work outside the camp, carrying very heavy stones. But the most horrendous part of it all, there was a man in Auschwitz whose name is Tauber. And I eventually asked Wiesenthal whether he knew what happened to this pretension of a man. And apparently he was caught, or he died anyway. But I remember him very well. He was in charge of the selections as people would come back from a very long and a very difficult and a very hungry day. You were made to jump 5 feet of a ditch, and many didn't. If you were able to jump across about 5 feet, maybe more, I don't know, then you were okay. If you didn't, then you never went back to the camp. I mean, this was a little play. Cruelty in its most perfect form. And that went on for quite some time. During that time, my sister once put her hand in her pocket because it was freezing. And I never will forget that. I heard the tremendous slam of a whip on her back. The officer, one of the guards, said, "Don't you ever do that again." In other words, you're not allowed to put your hand because you were frozen to death. into your pocket. Sarah one day complained of not feeling very well, and she says, I don't think I can get up. It was a Friday. And I said, I don't care when you can get up. You've got to get up, because if you don't, they will take you to block 25. You know, you become very wise very quickly, and you learn to know what block 25 is, because when you would pass by, you would see dead bodies. That was the daily side. Nobody even, you don't even cry anymore. There are no tears left. Excuse me. But Salah couldn't go to work. She probably had typhoid, we don't know. I mean, it took Sunday night, she was dead. She didn't go to work on Friday. I went to see her in this block 25 or hospital, whatever that was, such as it was, on Saturday. On Sunday I came to see her. That was April the 10th. So here is a beautiful, brilliant, talented, healthy, athletic, 18-year-old girl, delirious with fever, looking at me, and she says, I have to get up because tomorrow is my sister's birthday and I didn't get her anything. And I held her in my arms, and she died in my arms. Watching this incredible drama was a woman that I did not know. She came up to me and she said, in German, which I did not understand very well then, she says, I don't have any children, I'm not married, but if I had a little girl, I would like her to look just like you and be just like you. Come. Martha had been in Auschwitz 3 months before we had arrived there. She was a nurse by profession, an operating room nurse. But in Auschwitz, at that time, she was carrying dead corpses, which was... She witnessed this incredible little drama, and she said, Hab kein Angst nicht, don't worry, little girl, I will take care of you. Martha was about 20 years older than I was, and take care of me she did. She saved my life about 4 or 5 times, 4 from the crematoria and others when I was deathly ill with typhoid or God knows what else. And she would steal injections and save me that way. So Salah died, and I cried very bitterly that day. And then years went by before I cried again. I just did not cry. I couldn't. Once you let your defenses down, you're done. People say, you're very strong. And I think that's bull. What does it mean? How do you practice the art of survival anyway? It's not a question of strength. You don't even know it's happening to you. What it is a sort of self-discipline by saying, if I'm going to make it, I'm going to retreat from all that and emerge in a way into my own fantasy world. And it's very healthy. I have subsequently done quite a bit of reading in my studies, in my undergraduate and master's programs, in various psychology books, a lot of which, by the way, I do not agree with. And Bruno Bettelheim's idea was something that I really could not agree with. The guilt of survivors. I don't have guilt for surviving. I was guilty. I said, why am I the only one? But can one question God or nature or fate? I don't know. But this whole idea that one is guilty because one survived, it is not guilt, it's something else. And I don't think it's guilt at all. But the idea of fantasy is a very healthy idea. Even today, when things become a bit difficult, and I am alone, I'm at home everywhere, and I'm home nowhere. It's my life has been so totally uprooted at such an early stage that I have never been able to say, this is the only place I feel home. I can feel home everywhere, or make my home anywhere and be perfectly comfortable about it. But to come back to your original question, Salah's death was very, very painful because she was a tremendous moral support for me. She was my older sister. She and I recognized that we will never see our parents again. And I knew exactly what happened to my parents. And I still, until this day, don't want to know or think that hopefully they were not conscious when they were thrown into the crematoria. And I had worked there for 3 months, sorting the clothes of those who went there. I continued to work, and then eventually, I don't know how, I really can't tell you, I was transferred to another camp. It was, this is Birkenau. When I talk about Auschwitz, Auschwitz is Birkenau the way we know it. Auschwitz is a town where some of the medical experimentations were done, etc. But the camp where over, I don't know, I think 2.5 million Jews were slaughtered, so were Christians, but for different reasons. And that's just as terrible. I was transferred, I think, to Lager C. And then I was made what they call eine Läuferin. Now, there were no children in Auschwitz, by the way, when I was there. There were, I think, 5 children. Because they only took the healthy, like say, from 18 to about 35 and so on. And I was really not. As again, how I made it, I don't know. That's something I can never understand. When I was in selections, which were all the time, and Mengele looked at me because I was so very fair. But then anyone who came from the north, whether you're Swedish or whether you're Norwegian or Polish, if you just happen to be light, then you're light, whether you're Jewish, Christian, or anything else, looked at me, and I remember his face. He says, "Are you Jewish?" And I said, "Yes." Well, first of all, not only my number, but I had a little triangle that indicated that was, even, put salt on the open wound. "Were your parents Jewish?" "Yes." "Das ist unmöglich." Somebody said, "Shut up. Don't you know this guy conducts experimentation of all kinds? Experiments of all kinds of things. He may want to do something to find out whether your blood is different than that of a Christian child." I didn't. But I was exposed to a great many, and again, without having any kind of understanding whatsoever. Why I was spared, I don't know. On 4 occasions I was not, but I was very, 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 very ill. I couldn't walk, and I was hidden. And again, Martha smuggled me into the Christian hospital. When I say hospital, I mean the block where only the Christians were. The Jews and the Christians were often not together. And put about 75 different dresses on me, because they all worked in the crematoria where you could get those things. But I couldn't walk because I had probably typhoid or whatever. And they would inject me with glucose or whatever else they could get their hands on to keep my strength up. I was 14 by then, looked like 10. And one day, Dr. Klein, or whoever else was there, came in to put down my number. Now, we knew that once your number had been taken, that's the kiss of death. And there wasn't even a question of crying. You sort of accepted the fact that you are going to die. And you lived with that death. I have to interject something right here. Later on in my professional life as a singer, I studied for one of my concerts a beautiful song by Franz Schubert to the poetry by Matthias Claudius called Der Tod und das Mädchen, Death and the Girl, where Death appears as a friend and he says, "Come, give me your hand, you sweet and lovely maiden. Don't be afraid. I'm your friend and I will take care of you." Well, later on when I studied that song, it became extremely meaningful because I was praying for that kind of a friend. During that time when I knew that I was not going to be here tomorrow, the woman who was in the next bed was a student of Sigmund Freud. somebody who was a well-known psychiatrist, and she was also, and she died.
This is now in Christian.
This is in the Christian hospital. Right. And I went to sleep. And I dreamt something quite incredible. And I told her about that later. I dreamt that I was walking on a very high precipice. I had very long blonde hair that mother used to do, like, Shirley Temple style. And I was wearing a white and pink dress that was like it was pure, it was a dream. I was walking and it was kind of moving around, and I knew that that I was walking towards the end and there was nothing there. I would have to fall and die. And I kept going anyway. Now, I couldn't walk in those days, mind you, but I was sort of running. And as I approached that enormously steep precipice, somebody jolted me and I woke up, and there was Martha standing in front of me with tears in her eyes. And she said, "My Kindchen, little girl, a miracle just happened. We have been able to erase your number from Klein's list, and you are not going to the crematorium." And I told it, I didn't understand what psychology was. I had no idea who Freud was, I thought reading Anna Karenina under the table was something forbidden, because... and she said that was a very, very revealing dream. She says, you've predicted your own future, without even knowing it at that time. That happened a few times. I was made Läuferin, meaning messenger. And because of that, because I was young, and because at that point you sort of, I don't know, they just accepted me there, I guess.
We are now back in Lagersee.
Oh, we were in Lagersee all the time.
Okay.
But there were different aspects of the life, quote unquote, in Lagersee. During Lagersee times, there was a woman by the name of Irma Grace, who was very frightening to be around. She was extremely beautiful, dressed as cleanly as you can possibly. You could see your face in her boots. She was always with an enormous German shepherd and a whip. And I was really very frightened of her. Everybody was. She would sick her dog on a poor inmate for no reason at all. And the dog would just about demolish that person. Very peculiar things kept happening to me. One evening, I don't know, one late afternoon after we were never allowed, we had our great big meal, stale bread and maybe a piece of salami and some horrible smelling coffee, then you could not go out. There was curfew. Someone, the head of the Blockführerstube, of the woman who was in charge of our barrack, who was always an inmate, came up and she said, "Teresa wants to see you." Now, I did not know that, and I didn't even know what homosexuality was, but apparently she was a lesbian. And because almost everyone there was 5 or 6 or 7 years older than I was. And people said, "Oh boy, shall we kiss you goodbye?" God knows what it is that she wants to do. I walked into that little office, and there was this Irma Grace standing in civilian clothes, and I must tell you, she looked like a vision out of another world. She was wearing a yellow coat. Her hair was blonde, and usually it was always very tightly pulled back. Her hair was long, let loose. She wore perhaps a little lipstick, I don't remember, but she was wearing a yellow coat, and she smiled at me. Imagine that. I was frightened to death, and she looked at me and she said, "I'll never forget that conversation. I have forgotten a great deal purposefully, because you can't live with all the memories, but there's some things that kind of stand out." And she said, "Komm mal her, come here." And she took my little cheek and she said, "Aha," she said, They tell me that you look a lot like Ike, and I wanted to be sure that that was really true. And I, in my total naivete, said, oh, I said, I don't think there's I've never seen anyone more beautiful, and I meant it. I mean, she was like a vision, you have to understand, we haven't seen anything like that. The woman took a liking to me. Thank God she never did abuse me, but she made me stand guard in front of the barracks while she would make love to the most beautiful Jewish girls there. She also gave me an extra piece of salami and made me do her boots or something like that. In other words, she sort of took a slight liking. I then found out, to my horror, when I was already in London and bought the book called The Bells and Trials, which is really the Auschwitz trials, Kramer and Hess, and that she was one of the 5 people who were actually executed for her crimes. She was 23 years old.
What did you know of her role in the barrack? She was SS?
Oh no, she was more than, yes, I don't know whether she was SS, I don't know, they probably were. This was the concentration camp guards, such as Grayson and or commandant like Kramer. They were of a different breed of people. They looked human, but these were not human beings. People, humanity as we know it, even in the worst possible way, cannot behave that way. There is a predisposition, there's a predilection to the kind of evil. They must have been chosen for the very fundamental, elemental qualities that these people possess to be able to perform and do what these people did. Because normal, quote unquote, people who have sensitivities and human qualities per se in the smallest quality cannot possibly behave in that manner. She was one of those. Now she could be perfectly lovely, she was nice to me. It may have been a little toy to her. I mean, you know, then I didn't have a relationship with her. She was in charge of Lager C. She had total power. She could do anything she wanted to anybody at any time, because she was the, I think the German word, over something or other, head guard person. And that's all documented. And I as I said, I bought the Bells and Trials after the war while I was in London and read it studiously in horror to read my own history, so to speak, because I lived in a little vacuum, not really knowing that in another camp other things were happening.
What did standing guard for Irma Grayson mean?
I beg your pardon.
What did standing guard for Irma Grayson mean?
You mean as far as I was concerned? Well, I was told that she was a lesbian. I did not know in those days what that meant. And that she was making love to another woman, and would I stay guard to see that maybe other Germans would be coming, or other guards of her caliber would be coming along if she wanted to be alerted. That's what it meant. Not all the time, sometimes.
To your knowledge, did she injure or kill the women that she made love to?
That I don't know, but she injured and killed an awful lot of women, period. She had close to, thousands of people that she had tortured. But I don't know whether that was done during her tryst or not. I doubt it, but I don't know. That I can't tell.
Can you describe any other incidents with Irma Grayson, her behavior with other people?
Yes, I can. When we would have what we call the Zählappell, that means that in the morning the roll call would take place. And because I was Läuferin, that means that I would be there to deliver messages to the central block, to the commandant or to anybody, and bring it back to the people in the camp. She would make us stand for hours at a time in freezing, horrible weather, or very hot, depending. I was one of the still don't understand. I was there for 2 years. I have told people when they used to ask me what my educational background is, I said I have a PhD from Auschwitz. That covers a lot of ground, doesn't it? Not really. The world really doesn't. The world is not really that interested from the human. There are always those who are. Majority still have really no idea what happened. It's too painful to grasp. They can't be bothered. But Irma Gris would let us stand for hours. People would faint. She would trod on them. She would beat them. She would sick her dog. She would punish people very badly. She was very cruel. She was extremely cruel. They did not execute, Nuremberg did not execute many people. A great many people were put into many different sentences, prison sentences, but they executed her. So they must have had far more evidence that I'm giving you here today, documented. But from my own personal experience, that is precisely my recollection, except that I didn't realize that she was 23. I don't know, age at that point didn't really mean terribly much. But she was 23 years old, which seems pretty extraordinary to have reached the power of such depth of deprivation at such an early age. And so she was executed in Nuremberg. Yes.
You have mentioned that you were in selections with Mengele.
Mm-hmm.
Can you describe one of those selections for us?
Yes. What was so striking, and in fact, everything that I'm saying to you today is sort of in retrospect how weird those events were. Mengele never raised his voice. He would simply stand there with this finger, and this meant one thing and this meant another thing, and he says, you know, you've really lived long enough. I think it's time to go on, in that kind of a manner. I never heard him raise his voice. He didn't have to. He relished and enjoyed every moment of his glorious power. So you see, when you think of Mengele, which is unbelievable, this is a monster, this is a medical doctor. When you think of Klein, when you think of the great minds, in a sense, educated people, the crematoria, as I've mentioned in some of my speeches, the few times I do speak subjectively, and this is one of the few times that I do, the crematoria were designed and built not by idiots, not by people who didn't know what they were doing, but by highly educated, trained PhDs who knew exactly what they were doing. And they designed that whole Dante's Inferno. You know, there's a line in Dante's Inferno that says, Lasciate ogni speranza voi che entrate. That means, abandon hope all ye who enter here. Now, when Dante wrote this in his Inferno, he must have been thinking about Auschwitz, or places like Auschwitz, or people like Mengele, or like Kramer, like Höss, like Grese, and like so many others whose names I don't exactly remember, who were not formally introduced. The other thing about Auschwitz that I remember that helped me is to have a sense of humor. And people say, how can you do that? If you cannot laugh at yourself, you die. By the way, that's true of today too. People who take themselves very seriously are bores. But when you do not have a sense of humor during that time, and you really recognize the depth of the tragedy around you, you can't make it. Because if the mind can still function, it can overcome all kinds of extraordinary circumstances. So we would say, hey, I'll see you tomorrow on the soap board. That sounds horrible, doesn't it? But the truth is that, as you know, they would make all kinds of, the Nazis, I should say, were very, very clever as to what they were doing. They wasted nothing. Everything was a must for fortunes of war, and the fat would be used for certain productions, including soap. Now, it sounds horrible today. It sounds depraved. But at that time, it was a way of saying, we know what's going to go on, there's nothing we can do about it. So let's laugh.
On that note, let's hold it for a minute. Let them change tapes.
Good, I need a break.
Okay, Bonnie.
You know, I would still have another cigarette if anyone has that. Darn, and I won't be here.
Stand by, she's telling me. Okay. Shall we start again? Okay, let me ask the question again so that it's on tape. You had described several times that Marta helped you a great deal. Can you describe other incidents other than the one in the Christian hospital where she helped you?
Yes, well, I was first in a Jewish hospital. Well, the word hospital is incorrect. It's fallacious. There were no hospitals. There was a block where you went if you were sick and if you were Jewish, which that means you never came out of there. Martha worked with the doctors because she was a nurse. And somehow she was able to get medicine, injections, which she was able to administer to me, which kept me alive. The Christian inmates in the Christian hospital were allowed to get packages from home and would share some of the goodies from home with me because I was the child, you see. I was that little girl. And then on a few occasions, Martha actually was able, with the help of someone else, to remove the number that was written down for me to go to black pastures, if you can put it. Something that the normal mind, and when I say normal mind, I mean people who, thank goodness, thank God, have not experienced my adolescent years, would find it extremely difficult to grasp. Maybe people who were in Vietnam might, to some extent, understand that when you walked out in the morning for the roll call, you would literally see hundreds of emaciated bodies, still warm, piled up in front of the barracks. And you didn't cry. That was it. It was like you are in hell, and that's part of hell. When I think about it today, I said, how is it possible? It's beyond me. It is a question, when people say, how did you survive? I haven't got the foggiest idea. There is no earthly reason in the world why I was chosen to talk to you today. I don't know. Maybe there is some plan that the heavens, God, whatever, that I'm here, maybe to bear witness. And that is why I have set my own feelings aside, which is not easy, to share with you some of my own remembrances, so that perhaps the people or the children or whoever is going to perhaps hear what I have to say today will recognize that the madness that is in our society today of neo-Nazis who say that the Holocaust never happened, that this is the pure imagination of the Jewish community, will know that theirs is a dangerous path. And the Holocaust did not only happen, but it's a very living reality.
Is there anything else about Auschwitz before we move on? Anything more about Auschwitz that you would want to add or to tell us?
The only way I can describe Auschwitz is it was the deepest descension of what we considered in our wildest imagination for hell to be. Auschwitz was the final the final apocalypse. It cannot be described, really. Even I, who was there for 24 months, have difficulty, and I'm sure that I had deliberately forgotten quite a great deal. I don't think I could function as a human being and be as accomplished in many ways and continue on with life if I had to live and remember what happened to me there. And I think, again, here the mind works some miracles, because you remember what is essential, but you sort of forget all the other. It's like having a baby. You remember the beauty, but you don't remember the pain, because otherwise no woman would ever have a baby. And Auschwitz was something, it was the cradle of death. It gave people who were deranged the absolute perfect opportunity to exercise their wildest, macabre behavior.
Under what circumstances did you leave Auschwitz?
Actually, I didn't leave Auschwitz. I was evacuated. I was there till the last bitter moment. Excuse me. Before I answer you that question, I just want to say something which I find very important. Yes, there were many other people in Auschwitz, Christians, political prisoners, prostitutes, homosexuals, murderers. But I want people to understand one very important thing. It was primarily an extermination camp of the Jews of Europe. Because the Christian inmates were not subjected to the same treatment. They were not subjected to crematoria. If they sinned, quote unquote, according to them, they were hanged. I don't know that there were any selections for the Christians. They were there as criminals and treated as such, as though it was a prison. Terrible prison for them. But Auschwitz and the concentration camps of Europe were made for one reason and one reason alone. And that is to, I don't want to use exterminate, because you exterminate cockroaches, for the murder of Jews. And 6 million died, not just in Auschwitz, in others. I think that's very important to understand. And I have primarily spoken to Christian groups in my short few years that I have decided that I had a responsibility. I wanted to speak to the Christian community to make them understand that. Now, I left, or I would say I didn't leave. I was evacuated from Auschwitz on January 24th. I came to Auschwitz on January 24th, 1941, and evacuated on January 18th, 1945. That was another terrible time. We actually went through Berlin and saw a leveled city. By that time I spoke fluent German, you see, I didn't go to school there. Fluent German, fluent Hungarian, fluent Czechoslovakian, fluent Italian. I mean, there were so many people from all over the world. And I wound up in a dreadful place called Ravensbruck. Very bad.
How did you get from Auschwitz to Ravensbruck?
By train. I don't know how many days it took, but counting was not one of those things that we did there. It was by that time the end of January, or maybe 2 weeks later, maybe 10 days after, I really don't know, but it was January. Ravensbrück was built for X amount, like maybe 3,500 people, and at the time that we were there was something like 15,000 people. It was dreadful, horrible, and extraordinarily, I met Marta there. And she said to me at that time, if anything happens and either one of us is alive, I want you to meet me in such and such a city after the war. And she's still alive, she's in Brazil, and I went to see her in Brazil. She's quite ill. She has never recovered from Auschwitz. I guess she must be about 75 now, perhaps, I don't really know. But anyway, after after Ravensbruck, of which I have a blur, because it was terrible, and like typical Marta, she shared her slice of bread with me, and still reprimanded me because I mean, she sort of imagined herself that I was her little girl. And then...
Don't go by Ravensbruck, even if it's a blur.
Oh.
Quite so quickly. How long were you there?
I would say about 3 weeks.
What, through the blur, can you remember of the camp?
Masses of people, death, terrible starvation, no work. We didn't work there. There was some chaos at that point. Don't forget, this is January 45, and I think Auschwitz, in fact, had already been liberated by the Russians. And we were just kept going on. I can't tell you too much about it because, as I said, I remember being praying, let's get this out. I don't want to live anymore. I mean, you can't go on like that. I knew there was no one left, as far as my family was concerned. I knew there was no way. I don't know what happened to Martha after that, because we were separated. And then, again, we were put on trains and driven further into what was still the remaining of the Third Reich. And I wound up in a camp called Retzow am Rechlin, which was apparently not originally a concentration camp. It was a camp that was built for the men or the women who worked adjoining. There was a very large factory where I was told that they manufactured the missiles that eventually devastated London. And so that it was a much more relaxed camp. There were no crematoria. It was already confusion. I mean, this was already beginning of February, end of January, February, March, April. I was there actually until, perhaps I was in Ravensbrück longer than that, because I think I was in Retzow for about 3.5 months.
Can you describe the camp for us? Where were you taken first?
I don't remember. It was not the same procedure that was both either at Auschwitz or Ravensbrück. We were brought on trucks, in fact. Not on a train, to my knowledge. We were on trucks, and we were quite sure they were going to shoot us, because Retzow is surrounded by many woods. What struck me about that camp was that it was relatively nice, meaning that it was not, the barracks were different. They were much more, the berths were much bigger. It was smaller. There may have been maybe 2,000, 2,500 people. Mainly women. I don't remember seeing men there. It was much looser. Looser in discipline.
How did that manifest itself?
How do you mean?
You say it was looser in discipline. What did that mean?
It meant that the behavior of the guards was not as obnoxious and as scary. They were primarily men, German soldiers, rather than women. Women could be terrible, by the way. The women in Auschwitz were horrendous. The German women. There were, to my recollection, no women. There was a women's camp, but they were mainly men who were the guards. The commandant was not as scary as I remember, say, a Hessore Kramer. The majority of the workforce, we worked in the woods, where we would chop wood for the war production. Because again, this was around the woods, and we never thought, by the way, that we would get out of there. Never. We were quite sure that we were going to be shot, that they could not everyone had a number, not that many were out of Auschwitz, but some of us were. In fact, majority, there are really not that many who have that kind of a number as I do, because, don't ask me why, Providence, je ne sais pas, I don't know. So that Retzow particularly after Ravensbruck, was heaven. I mean, you could. And again, they asked me, what did I do? I mean, everybody sort of did something. If you survived that long, my God, what did you do? Said I was a loitering. Oh, good, we need a loitering here. So immediately they gave me that bandana with the Gothic letters, and I became a loitering. That means that I could go to the kitchen, and sometimes the German woman in charge would throw me an extra piece of bread. I didn't eat very much in those days. I think that I really think that it may have contributed somewhat to my survival. As a child, I didn't eat much food. I did not eat very much there. And so much so that when I eventually came to this country, and my aunt was very concerned because I could go 3 days without eating, and she took me to the Bellevue Hospital for some tests. They found that my stomach had shrunk very considerably. I simply was not accustomed to sitting down and eating a normal meal. I still can't do 7 courses in one evening. I have tried to justify why I and why not somebody else. And it's not the guilt in me, it's the questioning why. And I have no idea. I don't know. It is absolutely against all odds.
Can you tell me, what did you do in Moscow? Did you work, and what was your work, in addition to being a lover?
Primarily, I was a loitering, which means that I stood inside the gates of the camp, and be ready to be at anybody's beck and call from the main Blockführerstube or the guards who needed something, or bring their supper or whatever. And then I worked for a while in the woods with the other commando, chopping woods, which was a little heavy work. And that's basically what was going on there. There were other things there. There was some seamstress who were doing some clothes correction, I remember. As I said, this camp had different things, but you have to understand, again, I wish I could be more descriptive to you as to what, how, and when, but I really can't, because I can only tell you from my memory what I did when. I really don't know. There were so many other aspects, and we didn't exactly share the information on what was going on 5 blocks away. So that a great deal of my information not about my own subjective experience, but about the entire tragedy of the catastrophe, I learned by reading about other people's accounts and by reading historical and documentation of that nature.
We, of course, we're going to focus here on you.
Right.
Can you tell us of, do certain things that went on in the camp or in your experience stand out in your memory?
Yes, it does. In fact, what stands out in my memory, even in Auschwitz, was that humanity was not lost among the survivors, among the inmates. People did care for each other. People did give each other moral support. People did commiserate with each other and try to help. There was very little because people were dying. And the suffering was so intense that it was very difficult to give strength to someone else. But Martha is a perfect example. There were a few others who extended a helping hand. But the one incident that comes about me is a very unusual one, and a very far out sort of an incident, because it came from a German soldier in Retsov am Rechlin. There was a young 19-year-old guard who very shortly after I arrived there started to look at me very differently, and I didn't know why. We spoke, we met. He was actually from Luxembourg. He was a medical student. He was brought in there. He said to me, "What are you doing here?" The first time I saw him. He was a guard standing on the scaffold with a gun, and I was down here standing, and he started to sing me a little German song. And I thought, boy, this guy has a real sense of humor, And he said, "Listen, what are you doing here?" And he didn't say it in an angry way. And I thought to myself, he's crazy. I said, "Well, I'm Jewish." And he apologized, and he said, He was obviously very green. He didn't realize. He said, look, I knew what was going on in Germany with the Jewish community. But I was a medical student until just a few months ago, and I had no idea to what extent the brutality went on. I'm only now learning from the older guards who talk about it with relish. And I go out and I vomit. This young 19-year-old medical student, ersatz guard, because they needed new people, and they brought anyone in, Romanians, Bulgarians. Eventually, within a few months, was willing to risk his life by saying to me, you are not going to survive because they will kill you. The rumor goes around that they will shoot everybody here. They don't want to, whatever is left, they can't leave that much evidence. I have contacted a woman in the village who lost her husband and 2 sons, is very bitter, told her about you. She said she will give me civilian clothes and I will take you there when there is a break. I promise you. And I said, why are you doing it? He said, because I love you. Now you have to understand that here is a Jewish girl, 16 years old, speaking to a man wearing a German uniform, saying, I love you and I'm not going to let you die. I'm going to help you. I said, we can both hang for it. Don't say a word to anyone. It's a long story which I will not go into now, but I was he was incredibly tender. He asked me to join the commando because he wanted to tell me more about it. And he says, speak to the commandant. Everybody eventually winds up going to the woods and working there, and he let you, which I did. I was scared to death, but the commandant knew me. And he said, okay, you can rotate with the other girl. As I said, this was a little more human. You simply didn't go to a commandant and say, do you mind if I go work someplace else? This is just not the way it was. And Lucien had all the plans. He was incredibly tender. He was incredibly beautiful. And I said, what is going on with me? What is happening here? How, you mean there is still a heart beating in somebody who's wearing a German uniform? Here's a Christian boy and a Jewish girl caught up in hell. And I must admit, I didn't know. I mean, I knew that nature was beginning to play havoc with me, but I didn't know what the word love is or anything. I mean, I didn't know that one does, that there are normal emotions, which nature was letting me know were happening. One night, he said, very abruptly and very angrily, while he was there, he says, I want my supper in my Blockführerstube today. Bring it to me. So I brought the tray and I knew there was something wrong. And I walked into the Blockführerstube. There was bedlam there. This was already April, I don't know, maybe April 20th, maybe April 25th, somewhere around there. Probably closer to April 25th. And I opened the door, and there he was standing without a gun and without a tie, the white shirt open slightly, without his cap. And I knew something was terribly wrong. He said, put down the train. He said, we just got word that we have to evacuate like immediately tomorrow morning. I cannot help you. I cannot bring you out of here. But I pray to God that you're going to live, because I'm going to find you. And he gave me a magnificent poem and a photograph of himself in civilian clothes. It was the most bizarre thing. It was like a icing on a cake of some kind that was just, what's going on here? Well, to cut a long story short, we were evacuated, and then I found out that he was killed in action on the Russian front. But he made an impact on me. He made an enormous impact on me because people say to me, I have been asked, do you hate the Germans? No, I don't like to hate anybody. I hate the Nazis. I hate the people who have perpetrated that disaster on people. But you cannot simply say everybody is rotten. No, they're not. People are people. There are rotten people everywhere. But this incident, having just spent 45 months in camps and ghettos, to have somebody in a German uniform with a gun, supposedly guarding me, say to me, I'm going to risk my life for you, I'm going to let you escape because they will kill you. And I may be killed with it, but I love you, was an inkling that maybe there is, after all, another world, of which I knew nothing about.
Quite a story. What happened to you the next day?
We were evacuated in the middle of the night, just as Lucien had predicted. And we were quite sure that we were going to be killed. And we were not put on trucks, we were walking. No idea where we were walking. That was May the 2nd. And I'm really coming to the end of the war. Everything, we were at this point here. Germany was combined of a tiny little spot with the Americans and the English and the Russians and the French on all sides. They kept going with us. Of course, the guards were much more relaxed. They knew that this is the end. There was just no way. But they kept walking us for a week, for what seemed like endless. A lot of people couldn't make it and went by the wayside. In fact, that's when I asked one of the older guards, I said, by the way, you know that young fellow, Lucien, who was at the gate, whatever happened to him? And he looked at me, he said, he says, Booby, yeah, he said, we got word that he was killed at the Russian front 2 weeks ago. Well, I thought, he didn't feel anything, I did. We went on and on and on, and finally we couldn't really walk anymore. This was already like May the 4th. And I say May the 4th because May the 5th I was liberated, so I knew that it had to be. There was a terrible bombardment. I mean, we heard, and it was the most beautiful sight in the world to see planes, hear I don't know whether they were American, but they were certainly Allied planes, and tremendous fires from tanks and stuff. And we hid during one of those terrible raids in a bunker and never went out. Nobody looked for us anymore. And that was it. The next day, we slept that night we slept in a barn we found with the cows and pigs on the bottom. And the next morning, very early, the sun was still shining. I looked through a crack and I saw a Russian soldier. And I jumped out, woke everybody. There were about 12 of us, other girls who were with me, or I was with them. And he must have thought I came from another world. Well, I did. And I spoke fluent Russian, so I recognized. And I'm very sorry to tell you that eventually when we went to another town, we wanted to be repatriated so that we could find out, because we were completely isolated. This is now East Germany. The Russian commandant, whoever he was, who was repatriated, and I mean, people had no idea yet what was going on. People did not digest the horror. Maybe the Russians did because they liberated Auschwitz. But generally speaking, May the 5th was not yet a day that people knew what was going on. Even Dachau, which was liberated by the Americans, and Buchenwald and all that, the general public, so to speak, didn't yet know, including some of the Russians. And he says, you mean to tell me that there are some Jews still left through all that? But he said it in a way, and I thought, here I was, the pioneer as a child, being taught about the greatness of Russia. I believed that garbage. And here is somebody throwing that anti-Semitic remark to me right back in my face when I hadn't even gotten out from the blood-stained clothing. That was quite an awakening to me. I was jolted into another kind of a reality for which I never quite recovered. Meaning that, and this is why I have contributed some of my time, what had happened then can happen again. And unless you and I, and people like you, and many like you, and the Holocaust Memorial Committee and the museum do not keep an absolutely alert, vigilant eye, we may all be in trouble again. And it may not just necessarily be the Jew. It can be anybody who has green eyes and dark hair. Anything can happen. hope I have answered some of the questions you wanted.
Tell me how you got, very briefly, from there to here. What happened after liberation? Where did you go?
Very briefly, I will try to do it, but as briefly as I can, because I was first in a repatriation camp in Germany. Since Marta told me to meet her in a place called Žilina, which is Slovakia, not Czechoslovakia, but Slovakia, and I spoke fluent Slovakian and fluent Hungarian, which everyone apparently does there. And I knew that I had absolutely no one left in Grodno, and it was just, there was nothing to go back to. I had been completely alone. That was a reality that hit me very quickly in the face. Now what? I told them that I was born in Žilina and that I was going to Czechoslovakia. The only trouble I had to convince them is that I really was 16 because I looked like 10. And they were going to put me with the orphans program. And I didn't want to be with the children's program. I wanted to go on my own. And so I convinced them and told them I was 2 years older than I really was, which they didn't really believe me, but somehow I managed. And I went to Prague. That's another story, not for today. That's quite an incredible story all by itself. I spent encapsulated is that I was supposed to, I went on a 4-day bus from Prenzlau to Prague, and most of the people on that bus were people who were prisoners of war or slave labor. And they were all met by a member of their family at Prague. And I went down, and for the first time, that was July of 1945, I suddenly realized that I am absolutely and completely alone in this world. That hit me, as if to say, now what? But I didn't. I mean, if you go through an experience like Auschwitz, you sort of don't become philosophical and say, well, now what? And I was determined to go to Žilina. And I was given, I had no money, of course. They gave us a ticket. They told us where to go and said, get a ticket, you don't have to pay for it, and then you'll sleep at the Jan Masaryk house. So I went to the thing and I got a ticket, but on the way back I didn't know who Jan Masaryk was, and I forgot where I was supposed to be, and I couldn't remember the name of the house. So I sat down at Vatlaske Miesto, where all that stuff was just going on there. And I sat down on a bench and I said, okay, I will sleep here tonight. It was a lovely night, it was July, and a little tiny white sweater and a little tiny bag like that. That was my whole belongings. And I said, I'll wait here until tomorrow. I didn't know what I was supposed to do. I was alone. When a young man comes up and sits next to me, starts talking to me in German. My German was very good at the time. He says, what are you doing here? And I explained the story. He says, well, do you know that your friend is in Žilina? No. Do you have any relatives? I have an aunt in New York. Well, I could help you. Maybe write to her or do something, but I can't help you if you were there. Why don't you let me help you? Okay. It was like life and death decisions made at the spur of the moment. He could have raped me. He could have done anything, right? He took me to a Catholic convent, and I stayed there for 3 months. And his father worked for a rather famous typewriter company called Švestka. And he got me a job there, and I learned Czechoslovakian, not Slovak. I spoke Slovakian. Within a very short time, I was earning a little money and living in the convent. And he was quite a remarkable man, and I have just given you a little tiny medallion, which he gave me at that time. And eventually, the American Joint Distribution Committee found me, through my aunt, I suppose. I wrote, by the way, that might interest you, I wrote 5 letters in Russian, identical letters to my aunt. And I wrote on each letter on the bottom, if you should get all of these letters, please don't think I've lost my mind. I'm fine. I'm giving it to an American soldier, and I don't know which one of them will forward the letter to you. And she got all 5. And she said, thank God you wrote that, because I would have said, the poor child is really not right. Then I went to London, and instead of being through the American Joint Distribution Committee with the orphans program, and instead of spending a year in London or 6 months, which they told me you don't know English, I think it's a good idea that you go there before you go to the States because you're on the Polish visa or quota. Why don't you go to London? and you can at least learn a little bit of English. And I said, well, very well, and I knew three words in English at that time. Thank you and peace. And it turned out to be 4 years, and I loved it. And so I came from Prenzlau to Prague, from Prague to London, from London to New York, etc., etc., and now I'm in Washington.
Nina, is there anything that you would like to add?
Yes, I would like to add by saying that the archives that are being collected and documented for posterity, articles, videotaping, lectures, books, are of an unbelievable importance. Not the Holocaust, you see, I never looked at it as a Jewish issue. It's not. It's a universal issue that affects each and every one of us. And the more the American public, the European, anyone, the Arab world, the black community, the children who feel very slighted for many good reasons, understand the historical, the sociological, the philosophical aspect of the Holocaust, the better off we all are. Because this is the greatest lesson that we can learn about humanity in any form or shape that you want. And I think that this kind of a preservation of history, not those that write their own to change their own times, is what might save the world, so that we do not repeat that. Because history has an ugly way of repeating itself, and we cannot let that happen.
Okay. Thank you very much.
You are very welcome.